Isn't that a lovely song? And you definitely sang better. So we're on the improve already. So I must say it's been lovely sharing in the ministry this week, and as we said on Tuesday, we were going to offer Bible studies direct, and there's at least 2 Bible studies that have been started so far in this congregation, and so we've got tomorrow and the weekend to offer some more. So thinking about the ministry, we're here at the Kingdom Hall tomorrow at 9:15, and then in the afternoon at 30 Crayford Road, 1:15. Saturday is 9:30 at the Kingdom Hall, and then Sunday ministry will be from 12. Tomorrow night the Elders and Servants meeting is here at the Kingdom Hall at 7 o'clock, and remember the public talk, to invite people to that. What marks the Bible as authentic? It really is a helpful talk for anybody that's just studying the Bible. Now tonight I've chosen as a theme, and I've just got to get something. It's helpful to have your notes. So this theme is serving Jehovah in our assigned boundaries. Now when you think about it, where were Adam and Eve to serve God? Well, initially they were to serve God in the Garden of Eden. They were in paradise, and they were to serve God in paradise. And we think it was a very big area, don't we? But we know that they sinned. And as a result of that sin, they were expelled from Eden. And now the Garden of Eden was what? It was out of bounds. They could not serve God in there. And to make sure they didn't, the cherubs were there with the flaming sword to the east. And we think, from that the rest of the sides of the Garden of Eden must have been mountainous and difficult to get at. So they only had to guard just the east side of Eden. So the Garden of Eden became out of bounds to Adam and Eve. Now later we know that they had children outside of Eden, and then some time passed by and Cain killed Abel. And then what happened to Cain? Well, Cain was banished from the ground where Abel's blood was crying out for vengeance. So he was sent away. King James Bible says he was sent to the land of Nod. The New World Translation says he was sent to the land of fugitiveness, because he became a fugitive now, and he wasn't allowed to be in that area where he spilt the blood of Abel. That was out of bounds to him. And now later, the Apostle Paul used an expression in connection with service to God, and this is seen here in Acts chapter 17 and verse 26. He was speaking to the Athenian people, the men of Athens. And here in Acts 17 and verse 26, he speaks about Jehovah God and says, "And he," that's Jehovah, "made out of one man, Adam, every nation of men to dwell upon the entire surface of the earth. And he decreed the appointed times and the set limits of the dwelling of men." Now when it says the set limits of the dwelling of men, literally, in the literal language, it is the setting of bounds. So he set bounds as to where people could live. And these were natural boundaries, things like the sea. You can't live in the sea. Even the man from Atlantis, he never was he? So you can't live in the sea. You can't live in lakes. Man cannot live in rivers. They climb Mount Everest, but they don't live up there, do they? So mountains and so on, the snow-capped mountains, make it impossible for people to live there. And they're all part of God's wonderful creation for our enjoyment and our benefit. But at the same time, in that creation, there is the setting of bounds, the setting of limits as to where people can live. Now, this verse also had another application, really, because in connection with the nation of Israel, God set limits or bounds. In other words, when he gave the nation of Israel their land, and the promise was to Abraham, there was definite boundaries. God said that it would be from the river, which was the river Euphrates, to the river of Egypt, and from the great sea across to the plains that were beyond the Jordan River. And that was the land that was given to the nation of Israel. And he made sure that others would have to treat them right within that boundary where they were to serve God in their assigned boundary. Interestingly, it wasn't until 400 years after they entered the promised land that they were actually able to serve God in their assigned boundaries. Because it was only in the reign of David, King David, that he pushed the limits of their God-given land to the limit. In other words, David extended their land correctly from the river Euphrates to the river of Egypt, and from the Mediterranean Sea across to those plains beyond the river Jordan. But interestingly, when they came into the promised land in the time of Joshua, the first thing that the Israelites had to do was to sort out tribal boundaries. So they had to work out where the tribes were going to reside in their promised land. And this was determined by two factors. Number one was the result of casting lots. Now you think about that. The lot was very important because Jehovah could do the directing. And in his deathbed prophecy, Jacob had indicated to some degree what would happen to some of these tribes. He'd said, for example, some would be by the sea. He said of Simeon that that tribe would be scattered among Israel. So when Judah got its massive land, Simeon was scattered in among the tribe of Judah. So that was fulfilled. So the lot, directed by God, could make that come about. The second factor was the size of the tribe. Although not mentioned in the Bible, it does seem to be another factor, and that was the fertility of the land. Because Dan was a big tribe, but they didn't get a big land. But obviously the land that they got was very, very fertile. So there was no complaint, no problem in looking after that particular tribe. Now all of that was sorted out by a committee. And the committee consisted of Joshua, the high priest Eliezer, and chieftains of the tribe. And they were the ones that had oversight of making sure that's where you're going, Levi. That's where you're going, Reuben. That's where you're going, Manasseh. That's where you're going, Ephraim, and so on. And they worked out exactly where the tribes would go. Now, once that was done, then they came down to the family holdings. And they got to work out in that promised land where each family would be. Now, again, this was assigned to a committee, and it was the committee of Eliezer, Joshua, and the chieftains again. They served as the committee who would work out the individual family holdings. Now, if I was to show you this, a vital part that I'd almost forgotten, if I was to show you that, do you know what that is? What is that? It is a Babylonian boundary marker. That's what it is. But the Israelites, this is a Babylonian one. You can see moons and suns, and Babylonian king sat on his throne there, and priests before him. But the Israelites had these as well. And we know that that was the case because if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 14, Deuteronomy 19:14, that's easy to remember, isn't it? Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 14. This was given by Moses before they came into the promised land, because these boundary markers were part of life prior to the Israelites coming into the land. And it said there, you must not move back the boundary marks of your fellow man. When the ancestors will have set the boundaries in your inheritance that you will inherit in the land that Jehovah your God is giving you to take possession of it. The ancestors there were that committee that I mentioned. They were the ancestors, and when they set it, it said you mustn't then move it back. So once it was sorted out, and there would be a boundary marker here and a boundary marker at the other end of the plot of land that was given to the family, then once they were set, and they weren't to be changed. But you can imagine situations that must have developed, you see. So you get the ancestors setting the boundary mark, and here we've got Brother Ben Musa, you see, and he's married with 2 children. And there's Ben Isaac over here, and he's married with 2 children. And so there's this huge plot of land, and the ancestors said, that's where the boundary mark is going. We divide it exactly in half. So, Ben Musa, that is your half. Ben Isaac, that's your half. Happy? Yes, we're happy. Thank you very much. That's fine. But then as time went by, you see, Ben Musa's still his wife and 2 children. But Ben Isaac has become fruitful and become many. And he's trying to fill the earth on his own. And he's got 10 children, you see. And now he's got 12 mouths to feed, and he's got 4. So what does Ben Isaac start to think? He starts to think now, this isn't fair. I've got all these mouths to feed, and yet I've only got the same land as him next door. So one night, when it's dark and nobody's watching, Ben Isaac gets up in the night and he nips out. And he just moves the boundary marker just a little bit. Hardly notice that. Scuff the ground round about it. Cut the little grass. No one will know that that's moved, you see. And off he goes to bed and sleeps the sleep of the just. And then he thinks that went off well. Nobody knew about that. So what does he do 2 nights later when there's no moon and it's really dark? A real big one this time, you see. And now he really sleeps now because he thinks this is getting more just by the day. This is better. And we can laugh at the idea of that taking place, but you just look with me at these little verses. Job 24 and verse 2. Job 24 and verse 2. And of course remember that this is dealing with life prior to the Israelites coming into the promised land. So it shows this practice was there and why God would include that in the law. It says there in verse 2, just that first sentence, there are those who move back boundary marks. You see, so they were doing it. And not just poor people, as it were, because go to Hosea chapter 5. Now Hosea is immediately after Daniel, so if you just find Daniel, the next book after that, chapter 5, and again just the first sentence of verse 10. Hosea 5 and verse 10, it says that the princes of Judah have become just like those moving back a boundary. Now they were doing that, and Jehovah took it very, very seriously, because in Deuteronomy 27:17, when it records the blessings for keeping the law and the curses for naught, Jehovah included in those curses, cursed is the man that moves back a boundary marker. It was as serious as that. Because what were they doing? Do you know, some were even doing this to widows. A little widow there, she hasn't got a man to defend her, so they were just probably even in the daylight, move over, woman. And that was it, and they moved the boundaries. And God considered it to be theft. You see, that's what it was. They were stealing land that didn't belong to them. And he viewed it like that and said, cursed is those that move back boundary markers. Now, why do we tonight look at these things? Well, because we've got boundary markers in a way, and for us as Christians, the boundaries are the laws and principles of Jehovah God. The laws and principles that are contained in the Bible for us are like boundary markers. It's as though God has set certain laws and principles, and he's saying to us, you don't violate them, you don't cross them, you don't. But we could be tempted to. It could be that when we're alone and we think nobody else knows, or if we're with people, association with people that don't respect God's laws and principles, then they're not guided by them. It's as though there's no boundaries to people in this world. Isn't that the case nowadays? There's anything goes. That's what they say. There's no restriction, no demarcation lines. So if we associate with people like that, or nighttime nightclubs and things of that nature, those kind of places and situations, so easy to think that we could cross the boundary and nip back and nobody knows, or move them in some way and feel that we can get away with it. Well, that isn't the case, you see, because Jehovah is aware of any breaking, violating, crossing of his laws and principles, isn't he? So in certain areas, it's just ever so important that we think about these kind of things. Think about the matter of courting. You see, look at the direction that's given in the scriptures in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verses 3 through to 6. Now this is Paul's counsel, and young people or not so young, if we start a courtship, if we're free to do so, then this is what it says. For this is what God wills, the sanctifying of you, that you abstain from fornication, that each one of you should know how to get possession of his own vessel in sanctification and honour, not in covetous sexual appetite, such as also those nations have which do not know God, that no one go to the point of harming and encroaching upon the rights of his brother in this matter, because Jehovah is one who exacts punishment for all these things, just as we told you beforehand and also gave you a thorough witness. So when somebody encroaches, as it says there, on the rights of another, then they really are doing something that Jehovah has warned against, and we need to be aware of that. When it comes to courting, the organization has said that people should have chaperones. Now, if you say that to people in the world today, they'd say, what planet have you come from? Wouldn't they? Because, again, in this world, anything goes. There is no boundaries, so you can get up to what you like. Why would you want a chaperone? But we just know that so that people can be clean at the time of their marriage, then there should be chaperones. And you know what I've always remembered? I was telling the congregation last week, and it really impressed people that really took it on board. It was something that Brother Noor used to say. He said, and really, it's in a watchtower to a little degree. One of these young people asked, a young brother who said he thought, because he thought he was strong in the truth, that he could be with somebody of the opposite sex and he'd know how far to go and when to put on the brakes and stop, you see, right? So he thought he could control himself and he'd be all right, he could handle the situation. Brother Noah used to say this. He said, if you think that you could be with somebody of the opposite sex, somebody you're attracted to, and you could deal with the situation and not be tempted and right circumstances and all of that, he says, you know, you call God a liar. And he says, why do I say that? Because, he says, God put the sex drive so strong in people that he knew the earth would always be populated. You see? So if people had got all this great control and everybody suddenly said, right, we'll stop that, won't do that anymore, what could happen to the population in time? Well, it could go, but God knew that it never would because the sex drive is so strong. So to make sure we're never in that kind of position, what does the organization wisely tell us? You have a chaperone. And that's, helping us to stay the right side of Jehovah's boundary markers. Now, secondly, when it comes to marriage, what does God's word say? It says, when it comes to marriage, you marry only in the Lord. And if you marry somebody not, you've crossed the boundary, you see. You've gone outside and you've become unevenly yoked with an unbeliever. That's the position. Now, some say, you see, well, there's not many eligible brothers around. You see. And to which I say, well, you're only allowed one, You can't be looking at lots of them. You're only allowed one. And in God's organization today, you think of Japan, you might have read about Japan, so many sisters in the truth and very, very few brothers. So what have those sisters had to do? They've had to resign themselves to the fact that they might not be getting married in this system of things, and it might be that they have got to wait. And they have done so very faithfully and thrown themselves into like full-time service and things like that and pioneered and wonderful, wonderful examples. But anybody who thinks, well, we'll circumvent that and I'll marry somebody out of the truth and perhaps they'll come into the truth. Well, you just think of it. The moment you say, I do, you've got an unbelieving husband. Haven't you? That's the moment you say, I do. That's the position if you marry out of the truth. And it might be he's just married you saying he's all this, that and the other until he gets you. And then he might say, you're not going to any more meetings, you aren't now. I'm the head of this house. And you don't know, do you? So it's very, very dangerous to go out there and marry people who have been out there in the world. And today's world, I think like this. I think people who have been out there in this permissive world, I'd be thinking, where have they been? Wouldn't you? Where have they been? Because they've had no restraint, no boundary markers for them. And you've got to think about that. Now that's another area. Let's take just one more, and that's it. And this is a very, very difficult one. But God's organization has set down definite boundary markers and guidelines for us if we're in this very unfortunate position. And I hope none of you ever are, but where you've got disfellowship relatives who are not living in your home, but they're living outside. When people have got disfellowshipped relatives, there are guidance as to how we should conduct ourselves. And if you listen very carefully to the district convention this time, there was a talk that dealt exactly with that at the district convention. And really it was saying very clearly that it should be no contact. While in the past we'd said things like necessary business, it didn't even mention that in the district convention talk. And when the brother was questioned afterwards. He said, I said it exactly as in the outline so that nobody could, come back and say, did you change the wording at all? No, he says, I said it just as it was in the outline. And that really gives people, when you think about it, a reason to right the wrong. If we carried on meeting with them for a cup of coffee in town, going shopping with them, round at their house, them round at our house, is there any reason for them to right the wrong? There isn't, is there? Because they've got the association that they probably want. I see my mum and dad whenever I like, and we do this together, we do that together, we've even been on holiday together. If that's the case, the disfellowship person has no reason to put things right. But if you toe the line and say, well, that's it, you've cut yourself off by your actions, and that's what I'm going to follow, then they start to think, oh, I wish I could talk to my mother about this, that and the other. I'd love my dad's advice on this, that and the other, but I can't. Then they've a reason to think, well, let me come to my senses and put things right. So the boundary markers are there loud and clear for us to see, and when we follow them, it does work for our good. Now, while there's boundary markers in the form of laws and principles to just guide us and protect us, there's other things in our life as Christians that know no bounds. And there's some work that we can do that has got no restrictions. And that, is the preaching of the good news. There's no limits set as to what we can do, because some have got more energy than others and some can do more than others. And in this connection, there's a wonderful example in the Bible character Jabez. Now, you can read about Jabez in Chronicles. If we look at 1 Chronicles chapter 4. Now, the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are all names, aren't they? There's 9 chapters of names. The ancestry of the Messiah is included in all of that. But here we come across a wonderful example for us as Christians, one worthy of imitation. 1 Chronicles 4 and verse 9 and 10. It says there, and Jabez came to be more honourable than his brothers, and it was his mother that called his name Jabez, saying, I have given him birth in pain. And whenever I read that, I think, why aren't all men called Jabez? Hey. But verse 10 goes on, and Jabez began to call upon the God of Israel, saying, if you will without fail bless me, and actually enlarge my territory, and your hand really proves to be with me, and you really preserve me from calamity that it may not hurt me. Accordingly, God brought to pass what he had asked. Now that last little statement, he brought to pass what he had asked, tells us that this was not a vow, but it was a heartfelt prayer of Jabez. And his request was that God enlarge his territory. Now, do you think Jabez was saying to Jehovah, I don't want to creep out in the night and move the boundary marker, but I'd be very grateful if you would? You think that's what he was asking? Well, the fact that God brought to pass what he had asked tells us that he wasn't asking for the enlargement of his territory at the expense of somebody else. Because what had God said? Cursed is the man that moves back the boundary marker. So Jabez was not asking for the enlargement of his plot at the expense of somebody else. He was wanting the peaceful enlargement of his territory. And you know what Jewish tradition tells us? That Jabez wanted to establish a school to teach the worship of Jehovah. That was his motive. He wanted land to build a school to teach people about God. He wanted to make disciples for God. So no wonder Jehovah read his heart, knew what he wanted, and brought to pass what he had asked. And that's why he was more honourable than his brothers. So how can we imitate his example? Well, we should not be afraid to pray for the peaceful enlargement of our territory, as it were. We could pray for Jehovah to work things out for us that we might be able to make disciples for Jesus Christ. In other words, pray for an enlargement of our share in the preaching work. It might be that we could auxiliary or regular pioneer, if that was possible. Now, in your own congregation, when I was here last time, you had one. Now you have two. That's 100% increase in regular pioneers. Isn't that wonderful? 100% increase in pioneers in your congregation. Well, we wouldn't mind if it was 200% increase, would we? In fact, we'd be a joy to see that. So if any can, become regular pioneers, that is something that we would really encourage, because there's no doubt about it, pioneer work is a tremendous protection for people in this world. It helps us stay the right side of the boundary markers, because we're really involved in spiritual things, and our minds are more attuned to spiritual things when you're in the full-time service. So that's the reason the organisation encourages it. That's the reason we pass on that encouragement to you as well. So the preaching work has got no limits, and the result of the preaching work is seen here in Isaiah 26 and verse 15. And this chapter, if ever you read it sometime, is the most thrilling chapter about the expansion and things that are taking place in God's organisation today. Isaiah 26 and verse 15, it says to Jehovah, "You have added to the nation, O Jehovah, you have added to the nation. You have glorified yourself. You have extended afar all the borders of the land." And that's what Jehovah has done, hasn't he? In 1918, the preaching work was in 14 lands. That's all. Today, Jehovah's extended the boundaries, and now 235 lands. And the anointed have done such a wonderful work. They've pushed the spiritual paradise, that's the land, the spiritual paradise. The boundaries have been extended as widely as possible. And it's just wonderful the way that has worked out. And there's no doubt about it, in your own territory, you've got a growing territory in Allenton. And you too, as they build these new estates, you try to push, and let them hear and see the benefits of the spiritual paradise. And we want to continue to do that, of course, in our territory. Now that's something, again, that God has not set limits on, no limits to the extent that the spiritual paradise will be extended. Now on an individual basis, there's something else that knows no limits. Look at Galatians chapter 5. No boundaries here. Galatians chapter 5, and we're going to read verse 22 and 23. Now very often we read the first parts of these verses, but notice what it says at the end of verse 23. Verse 22 says, "On the other hand, the fruitage of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faith, mildness, self-control." So there's the 9 fruits of the Spirit. But you notice what it says next. "Against such things there is no law." In other words, there's no law, no limits, no boundaries. It doesn't put restrictions or restraints on the development of those qualities. We can just keep developing them to a greater and greater degree. No elder will ever come round to you and say, "I've just got to give you a little bit of counsel because you are too mild." See? Or we've just got to give you direction as a congregation because you've just got too much faith and you must cool it a bit, or too much love or too much goodness or too much. Do you get it? There's no limit. It can grow and grow and grow. And I always remember a watchtower that dealt with these. We had one recently that dealt with them all in one session. But some years ago, there was a watchtower, each of them, a whole watchtower on each of these fruits. And when it came to self-control, it said, while it was last, it was not least. And it said, if we fail with that one, the other 8 have gone out of the window. Because you think about it, without self-control, where's our love? Without that, where's our mildness? Where is our goodness? Where is our kindness? Where is our peace? And so on. See, it's gone, hasn't it? So how wonderful to develop those qualities now. And can you see why life in paradise will be so beautiful when those qualities are displayed to the nth degree? Really wonderful. No doubt about that. So that's something in the positive side. You can think of boundaries and think of restrictions, but God's given us a work to do that knows no bounds. His spiritual paradise knows no bounds, and the fruits of the Spirit are not limited in the display there. Now, some of our youngsters and younger people can sometimes feel that in the truth, because parents might be saying no to this and no to that, they might think that their life is a little bit restricted. But if you feel like that, look finally at this scripture in Psalm 119 and verse 44 and 45. And I'm always reminded of the fact that we think Hezekiah wrote this as a young prince. Not David, Hezekiah, while he was a prince, because he speaks about being persecuted by princes. Who would be persecuted by princes? Well, another prince, wouldn't he? He speaks of being able to give a witness to kings. Who get an opportunity to witness to kings? Well, a prince might, you see. So everything indicates it's him. And he says there in verse 44 and 45, I will keep your law constantly, to time indefinite, even forever. And I will walk about in a roomy place, for I have searched even for your orders. Isn't that lovely? The man says, a young lad says, I can keep God's laws constantly, day after day after day after day, and I still walk about in a roomy place. So he didn't feel keeping God's law cramps my style, did he? He still felt he got a roomy place, enough freedom to do what he wanted, to enjoy life and love life, but still keep all the laws of God. And it's nice when we can have that we are serving God in a roomy place, enough freedom, but the beauty of serving God in this roomy place is it keeps us safe. It's like a storm outside, but we're inside. And we're not harmed by the storm. We're in a roomy place. We can move around with freedom, but we're safe. And while we're in that roomy place, we've got work to do that knows no bounds at all. So we've no need to move back boundary markers. We can keep the laws and principles of God, all of us, and serve Jehovah happily in our assigned boundaries. So we look forward now then to the rest of our week, and I'm sure that we'll have a lovely time and start perhaps some more Bible study. So we really look forward to your support tomorrow and at the weekend, and then there's a real interchange of encouragement. Now to conclude, I've chosen song 125. It's entitled Jehovah is on my side. I've chosen it because the third verse says Jehovah God has now enlarged his holy nation's borders, and for many that flock to do his will, keep his laws and orders. So that's very much in line with our talk. And we'll ask Brother Gordon, would you close in prayer for us, please? So 125, Jehovah is on my side.